Hi guys, it's Miss Weston. I'm here with you to get started on chapter 14. As always, we are going to start out with our journal prompt. So here is your question for the day. Your question for the day is, how can you show courage even when you're afraid? So throughout the book, we've really been thinking about what it means to show courage and different ways that people can show courage. So for example, yesterday Byron in chapter 13 showed courage by sharing his feelings with Kenny. We've also had an example where Byron shows courage by taking responsibility for his actions and for, owning up to what he did when he killed the bird. He knew that it was wrong, he buried it, and he took responsibility for his actions. So there's a lot of different ways we can show courage. It means more than just being brave. So I want you to think, how can you show courage even when you're afraid? Maybe it's asking for help or saying how you really feel, but there are a lot of different ways that we can show courage other than just, being brave, how we normally think of showing courage. So go ahead and pause the video and write your response in your notes and resume the video when you're ready for your vocabulary. All right, if you are back with me, that means you are ready for your vocabulary. I'm gonna actually move my face over a little bit here so that you can see the slide a little better. But our first word is familiar. And the word familiar means someone or something that you know or recognize. So here's my example sentence. The 5th and 6th grade teachers are familiar to you. You recognize us. You see us, at school all the time. Either you're in our class, you were in our class, or you know who we are. So in this slide, I put photos of Mr. Kloshchi, Miss Alapisco, Mr. Sally, Miss Ngali, myself, Miss Llewellyn, and Miss Layton. So we are all familiar to you, and we miss you. So go ahead and take a moment to write down the definition of familiar in your notes and then resume the video when you are ready for the next word. All right, if you are with me, that means you're ready for the next word, and our next word is concrete. So concrete is a heavy or rough building material that's made from a mixture of broken stone or gravel, sand, cement, and water. So for example, there are handprints in the concrete outside Miss Lang's classroom from past students. And in this video, you can see that there is a chicken who is walking through some freshly poured concrete before it's had the opportunity to harden. Our sidewalks are made out of concrete. They have to harden. It's mixed wet. As you can see in the definition, it's made with heavy materials, but also water. So it has to actually dry over time. And you can see that here's this little chicken just walking across it. And now that sidewalk is going to have little chicken footprints in it until somebody decides to fix it, or for however long the sidewalk is there. So that is what the word concrete means. I know that's kind of a long definition, so feel free to write in your notes whatever makes sense to you for that definition. You can shorten it however you need to. Resume the video when you're ready for your last vocabulary word today. All right, your last word is investigate. Investigate means that you look for facts or clues to answer a question or solve a mystery. So for example, if you read Esperanza Rising, there's a part in the book where her money is stolen. She has been saving money for a long time in order to bring her abuelita over from Mexico to join her family in California. And so my example sentence says, Esperanza investigates to find out who stole her money orders. So she's looking for facts or clues to kind of figure out and solve the mystery. And then I put in this GIF of Pikachu, who has got his magnifying glass and his hat and is really trying to investigate some clues. So go ahead and write down the definition of the word investigate. And then when you are ready, for the next part of the video, you can go ahead and resume. Guys, if you're joining me, that means that you're finished with your vocabulary and you're ready for the next part of our lesson. So just a reminder to you that The Watsons Go to Birmingham is a historical fiction text. And what that means is that some of the parts of the story, like Byron getting his lip stuck to the window, that's made up. That's just part of the story. But some of the parts of the story actually have to do with real historical events that happened, and the author is including them in the story because that is what the characters in the story and the family, the Watsons, what they would have seen and heard at the time to make it realistic. So I want to review some of the historical things that happened leading up to the Watsons being in Birmingham in 1963, just so that when you read the chapter today, you have a little bit more of a background and understanding. So we started, before we read the book, by learning about the Civil War, and we read that slavery in the United States existed for about 265 years, and you can see that on the timeline here, until 1865, which is when we know that the 13th Amendment was signed by President Lincoln. The Civil War ended, and all slavery in the United States became illegal, which means against the law. The next period of time that comes after slavery is what we call segregation. And you can see that segregation starts in 1865 and ends in 1964. And if you're keeping track, we know our story takes place in 1963, so it takes place right at the end of segregation. So here's the best way that I can explain segregation to you. Just to review, we talked about how segregation was having separate facilities in Birmingham, right? Separate schools, separate restaurants, separate restrooms, separate parts of town, where Black people and people of color were forced to use facilities that were not as good, if not very bad, in comparison to the facilities that white people would have. And so they were kept separate. The reason why segregation came into being is because with slavery, there's a lot of hatred. And even though we ended slavery legally, the hatred that people felt in their hearts and the anger that they felt in their hearts, they continued to take out on African American people, particularly in the South, because the people there were very upset about losing the Civil War and that their life had changed. So in order to still have the power and control that they wanted, but to follow the 13th Amendment, they came up with this idea of segregation, which is to have completely different neighborhoods, facilities, and ways of life, as I mentioned, that punish or hold Black people to a different, and people of color to a different type of law than white people. And we have seen this in our Jackie Robinson book, where, for example, there was a Black baseball team, and then there was the professional Major League Baseball team, which only had white players. And so Jackie Robinson was so important because he was able to break the color barrier, and he was able to integrate, which is the opposite of segregate. Segregate means to keep separate. Integrate means to bring together. Jackie Robinson was able to integrate his baseball team. So we're taking a look at what life was like right at the end of segregation in Birmingham, Alabama. In 1964, that's when the Civil Rights Act is signed, which makes it illegal to discriminate against people based on their identity, based on their race and their ethnicity. So that, if you look at our history in America, really, civil rights and protections because of your identity have really only been around for a very small chunk of time. So it's really important for you to understand that in 1963, we have groups of people of color coming together and advocating to get the Civil Rights Act passed so that their way of life can be better and they can be treated with respect and be treated equally. And you can imagine, just as during the Civil War, there were people who were not upset about, or who were not happy with that. They were upset and they wanted to stop it, and they wanted to keep life going the way that it was going because they were afraid. They were truly afraid. And so because of that, I'm going to show you this article to give you some context about some of the types of things that people were doing in order to prevent people of color from getting equal rights in the United States. So this article I have to show you is called The 16th Street Baptist Church Bombing, and it takes place in Birmingham. So I'm just going to read a little bit to you about the situation because you're going to see a very similar event take place in the book, and I want you to know where the history actually comes from. So I'm going to get started. If you'd like to read along with me, I'm going to get started by reading the introduction paragraph right here. In the 1950s and 1960s, the American people, backed by civil rights leaders like Martin Luther King Jr., were speaking out against racial inequality and discrimination. In 1954, the Supreme Court ruled the separation of Black and white children at school as unlawful in the Brown versus Board of Education case. While the ruling was met with resistance in many Southern white communities, many African Americans saw the case as a stepping stone to ending other racial inequality problems, and it eventually sparked a series of nonviolent protests carried out by Black communities that would continue for over a decade. The protests triggered outrage among police and many white community members, and soon some areas, mainly in the South, were experiencing frequent crime and violence on both sides. So, what the introduction is telling us is that in 1954, when the Supreme Court ruled that it was unacceptable for there to be segregation in schools because Black children and children of color were not receiving equal resources as white children, that is when organization starts happening, and we have people such as Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, Rosa Parks advocating to end segregation in other areas besides just at schools. So I'm going to read this next part, which is specifically about conflict in Birmingham, Alabama. In the 1950s and 1960s, racial conflicts were a big problem in Birmingham, Alabama. A lot of people thought of it as the most racist city in America. 21 bombs were set off at African American churches in the city between the years 1955 and 1963. People gave the city the nickname Bombingham. Many civil rights leaders were trying to help fix the problems in Birmingham. One of those leaders was Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. The activists worked to plan protests and events. The people who went to the protests often got arrested. The police in Birmingham did not allow the protests to happen without trouble. Civil rights leaders and community members went to the 16th Street Baptist Church to plan meetings, and it became well known as a place where the activists met. So what's important for you to understand is that before 1963, even though 21 bombs were set off at churches, no one was ever harmed, except in what you're going to read today, there is a bomb that's set off at a church, and there are people who are harmed. And this is a real life event, which is what this article is about, the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing. So I just wanted to give you some context before you read, because it is a really sad thing that happened, and it's a really important thing for us to understand so that we can make sure that it never happens again. So the key events to remember about the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing, it was a real event. It was planned by two white men in Alabama, and they were specifically targeting the 16th Street Baptist Church because activists would meet there to plan their protests and to plan how they were going to continue pushing for the legalization of the Civil Rights Act so that they could have equal rights and be protected by the law. So the white men were trying to stop the progress from happening, and they didn't stop the progress from happening. Unfortunately, they did kill 4 little girls who died in the bombing, and the author of The Watsons Go to Birmingham actually has dedicated the book to them. And your copy may be different than mine, but if you take a look inside after the dedication, it says there's an in memory page that dedicates the book to the little girls. As you're reading that, if you feel upset, there are ways for you to process your emotions. You can draw or sketch your feelings. You can take breaks if it becomes too upsetting for you. You can write down how you're feeling, questions that you have. You can talk to someone at home. You can talk to me. You can talk to Miss Singali. You can talk to anyone about how the chapter makes you feel. What you're going to focus on in this chapter is the ways that Kenny and Joetta show courage throughout the chapter, because even though some scary things happen, they are very brave and they show a lot of courage. And I want us to focus on that and what can we learn from the courage that they showed in a difficult situation.